All right, I trust you did well on quiz 12 just a moment ago. We're going to finish going over your ACT practice test now. We left off with number 50, so we pick it up with number 51. And we had 12 jurors needed for an upcoming trial. And when the jury shows up, there's a large pool of people, and then the prosecution and the defense both get to pick their jurors. They have to agree on who they want. So if the prosecution's got an issue with you, you don't get to be a juror. And if the defense has an issue with you, you don't get to be a juror. So pretty much they try to get people who they feel know nothing about the situation, which is important, so that you don't come in biased. They also want people who are generally not biased one way or another. For instance, if they're talking to you and you're like, I'm in favor of the death penalty in murder cases, they'll probably not select you because they don't want someone who has a preconceived notion. But anyway, there's 60 people. And the court records show, though, that only 40% of people who are summoned actually appear. And of the people who appear, a third of these are excused. So it says, if this trend continues, how many people should be summoned to have as close as possible to 60 people in the jury pool? So they give you this breakdown, right? They have all the people who are summoned. They say that 40% will actually appear, which means what percent will not appear, class? Do not appear. That's 60% of the people who are summoned will not appear. But of these 40% that do appear, some of them will be excused, and some of them end up making it into the pool of potential jurors to be cross-examined. And it says that a third of those people end up being excused. That means how many end up in the jury pool? Two-thirds. So far makes sense. That's kind of how I broke it down. And then I said, well, we need 60 people in the jury pool, right? That's 2/3. That means a third, half as many as that, are going to end up being excused. So how many people probably get excused? 30. Statistically speaking, there would be 30 people excused if 60 people end up in the jury pool. So how many people total must appear to get to this point? 90. We have to have 90 people appear. 90 then is going to be 40% of that number. Let me say that again. 90 is going to be 40% of the number summoned. 90 equals 0.4x. And if you divide both sides by 0.4, you'll end up with the correct answer, which is letter D, 225. 225. Questions on 51. So a little bit of backwards thinking to get to that point. Number 52. It says, what is the 275th digit after the decimal point in the repeating decimal, 0.6295 repeating? So it's 0.6295, 6295, 6295, 6295 over and over again, right? Well, how many digits are repeating here, class? 4. And we want the 275th digit, correct? Well, let's knock out as many sets of 4 as we can by dividing by 4. 4 goes into 27.
9 times.
6 times with 3 left over. 4 goes into 35. 8 times. With 3 left over, we have a remainder of 3. Or you can divide it on your calculator, and you get 68.75, right? Here's the advantage of doing it by hand, is the remainder. There's going to be 68 full sets of this, with 3 digits left to get to digit 275. Digit 1, digit 2, digit 3. So what's the 275th digit? The 9. How many have letter K?
I have J.
I have J.
All right, does it make sense? If it came out evenly, then that means the 275th digit would be this next one, right? Or about, if it came out evenly, then 5 would be the last digit, right? It just depends on the remainder. So that's the advantage of using a remainder method as opposed to the decimal method. Number 53. Oh, this is like this year stuff. It's asking for f of g of x. Oh, it says, for what values will f of g of x equal 0? Okay. So we know that f of x is x squared minus 4. And we know that g of x is x plus 3. Well, let's think about this for a second. I want f of something to be 0, right? So f of thing needs to equal 0, and f of thing is x squared minus 4. So we really want x squared minus 4 to equal 0, right? Well, that means 4 equals x squared. What values of x will this be true? 2 or negative 2. So you realize f of either positive or negative 2 will give me a 0. So that means that g of x needs to either be a 2 or a negative 2 to get a 0. Does that make sense? So g of what equals 2?
-5? No.
Well, if I plug in a negative 5, I get a negative 2, right? Negative 5 plus 3 is negative 2. What would I get if I wanted a positive 2? What goes in right here? Negative 1. So either a negative 5 or a negative 1 would give me a 2 or a negative 2, right? And then if I take f of 2 or negative 2, I get the 0. So that's my answer, negative 5 and negative 1, letter A, our answer. How many had letter A for number 53? How about this? What if I said f of g of x needs to equal 5? Okay? Then what that means is that this f function needs to spit out a 5. What needs to go here to spit out a 5, class?
3.
A 3 or a negative 3, right? Okay, so that means that the g of x needs to spit out a 3 or a negative 3. What would I need to spit out a 3?
6. Or -6.
3.
To spit out a 3, I need to plug in what?
0.
0. Or if I wanted a negative 3, what needs to go right here? Negative 6. Does that make sense how to think kind of reverse? Instead of, I know what x is, I need to figure out what x needs to be. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's what we're doing there. Number 54. Given that p is a positive number, and n is a negative number, so we know that p is bigger than n, right? And the absolute value of p is bigger than the absolute value of n. Which of the following has the greatest value? So p is big, n is little, and p is positive. Okay? So if I take a positive and I add a negative, do I get something big or small? Smallish. But if you subtract a negative, that's going to give you something bigger, isn't it? Because subtracting, so we know that p minus n is going to be big, p plus n is going to be small, right? And I want the biggest possible value. So I want to have, in the top, I want my numerator as big as possible. So p minus n. And I want my denominator as small as possible. This would be ideal. This would be biggest possible over smallest possible, but that wasn't an option, was it? Okay, but I at least want as big as possible, right? So that means I'm going to take either f or g. So far, so good? F or g are my options, because that gives me the biggest possible numerator. Now, one of them is over p, one of them is over n. But which one is bigger, p or n? P is big, n is small. But do I want my denominator to be big or small? Small. So I should go with n in the bottom to get the smallest, and of course it's absolute value anyway. So the fact that it's negative doesn't matter, does it? So therefore, there's my answer, letter G. Just some number sense, kind of logical thought went into that. Anyone get G for that one? Good. Questions? All right, number 55. Oh, lovely. If I equals the square root of -1, which we know it does, then I plus I squared plus I cubed over I cubed plus I to the fourth plus I to the fifth equals 1. Okay. You remember back in Algebra 2, you learned that anything to the first power is itself. Anything squared, well, that's the square root of -1 squared equals -1. I cubed equals -1 times I is -I. I to the fourth is I squared squared, which is -1 squared, which is +1. And then any bigger powers of I, like I to the 17th, you knock out all the 4s. 4, 4, 4, 4, 1. Right? That's how you get a 17. 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 1. Which means I to the 4th times 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 I. And those are all ones that don't matter, so it's really just I. Okay, we talked about that back in Algebra 2. So if it says I, well, I is I. I squared is -1. I cubed is -I. I cubed is -I. I to the fourth is +1. And I to the fifth, if we take out the I to the fourth is still just I. So this spell boiled down to you remembering from Algebra 2 what all your powers of I are. Then I and negative I cancel, negative I and I cancel. I'm left with negative 1 over positive 1, which equals negative 1, and there's my answer, letter B. Okay, but again, you had to remember that. Without it, you literally had no chance. You just throw a guess down and move on with life.
Is that going to happen a lot in the ACT? Not a lot, but is it going to happen?
I mean, you're expected to remember stuff you've learned, and you learned powers of I. Now, how will you remember it? That's what they're checking. They're seeing, do you remember this? And if you do, you do well, and if you don't, All right, questions?
And how often is it that people don't get a good score in the ACT?
Pretty often. All right, let's take a look at number 56. Do your best. That's all you can do, right?
And then you can take it again once you do bad.
Yeah, and hope you do better the second time, which doesn't always happen. Usually people do better the second time. But I don't want you to have to take it multiple times. One of the core of the graphs is the coordinate plane shaded solutions. Okay, so we've got x plus 2y less than or equal to 6. And we've got 3x squared greater than 12 minus 3y squared. Okay. This right here, if you were to put the 3x squared plus 3y squared is greater than 12. And we divided everything by 3, that would be x squared plus y squared is greater than 4. Or 2 squared. Now, if we had an equal sign right here, this would be a circle with a radius of 2. Remember, x squared plus y squared equals r squared. So if I want a circle centered at the origin with a radius of 2, that's going to look like this. But that's with an equal sign. This has a greater than sign. Greater than meaning it's got to fall outside the circle. And since there's not an or equal to, it's going to be dotted. You remember that with the no or equal to, dotted line, in this case dotted circle, greater than is going to fall outside the circle. This goes back to Algebra 2. So we have it narrowed down now to not G, basically. Okay, not G because it's shaded inside the circle. All right, now let's continue on, though, with the easier part of it, which is right here. That's linear. X to the first, y to the first. Slope-intercept form. Y equals mx plus b. Well, in this case, 2y is less than or equal to negative x plus 6. That means y is less than or equal to negative a half x plus 3. Do you see the slope-intercept form? I know that positive 3 is going to be my intercept. So my line should intersect up above the circle. That rules out letter F. I also know my slope is going to rise 1, run backward 2. Rise 1, backward 2. And because of the or equal to, a solid line. So I need a solid line coming down and missing the circle. Well, that makes either K or H. Do we see that? So the last question is, do I go with K where it shades above, or do I go with H where it shades above, or K where it shades below? Well, here go with the origin. If you plug in a 0 and a 0, 2 or 0 plus 2 times 0, or 2 plus 0 is 0. Is 0 less than 6? So the origin works. I should shade everything below, but still outside the circle. And the picture that matches is K. Questions on how to think through K. Now, I will admit, that takes longer, right, than a minute to solve. Now, hopefully you've built up some credit on this one. Notice it is kind of later. If you're rusty on that graphing, maybe you skip it. Because it's been a little while. But does that remind you, or throw a guess down rather, does that remind you about the dotted line if there's no or equal to, solid line if there is the equal to? I mean, you could rule out letter G just off that alone. The or equal to is on the line. It shouldn't be a dotted line. And the not equal to is on the circle, so we should have a dotted line on the circle. I mean, you can rule G out really quick. That at least gives you 1 in 4 chance instead of 1 in 5. You know, play the odds. Number 57. A, B, C, D are real numbers. Let me shut the door real quick. Given AC is 1, B plus C over D is undefined, and ABC equals D, which defined must be true. Oh, okay. When is a fraction undefined, class? If the denominator is 0. So if that fraction is undefined, what fact must be true?
D is a 0.
D has to be a 0, correct? And it says that A, B, C equals D, which means A, B, C equals 0, which means either A is 0, B is 0, or C is 0, right? But it says that A times C, stay with me, is equal to 1, which means A and C can't be 0. So therefore, B is 0. And there's our answer, letter D. B has to be a 0.
So am I technically wrong for putting B, which is A equals 1 and C equals 1?
Well, no, because we don't know that A and C are both 1. A could be 4 and C could be a 4th. That would still multiply to give you 1, right? Good question, though. That was a really good question. All right, 58. Hey, does this look like what we've been doing lately?
I thought you said we were done with graph.
Ah, the cosine curve. Look at that. And notice, it stretches all the way up to 3 and all the way down to negative 3. That means the amplitude of the curve is 3. Well, that rules out F and G for me real quick, don't it? So it's either H, J, or K. Now, notice the entire cosine curve is done 1, 0, or 1 down to negative 1 and back to 1, or rather 3 down to negative 3 back to 3. The whole curve is done by the time it reaches what? Pi. Which means the period, which is normally 2 pi, is done by just pi. So if period is 2 pi over b, what would b have to be for me to get pi? B would have to be a 2. So I would need y equals 3. We know it's the cosine curve, and the b value has to be a 2. Y equals 3 cosine 2x. And there it is, letter K. And that's what we were just doing, right? So there we go.
I got you.
Oh, does it make sense now?
We got K.
All right. Number 59. Figure shows a flying kite. Certain moment, the string forms an angle of elevation of 75 degrees. Same angle of elevation of the kite at point B is 45 degrees. What's the length of the string? Okay, so here's what I did. Let me erase real quick. Give myself just a little bit of room. I'll give you a pass to your next class, don't worry. We've got 240 here. We've got an angle of 45 degrees. We've got an angle of 75 degrees. This is angle A. This must be angle C, which I could find. 75, 45, what's left? 60, right? You do that on the calculator. And I know that this side's 240, and I asked for this side, B, which is the string. I don't even care about side A. This is not a right triangle. It's an oblique triangle. And so if I were to use the law of sines, I could say that A over the sine of A equals B over the sine of B equals C over the sine of C. I know that C is 60 degrees. I know that B is 45 degrees. I know that A is 75 degrees. And I know that side C is 240. And I'm looking for side B. Solve the proportion. 240 times the sine of 45, and then divide out the sine of 60. And what does that give you? 195-ish? Now look at your possible answers. Is that one of the easy answers? No. So in your calculator, try 60 times the square root of 3. Does that give 195? No. Okay, try 80 times the square root of 6. Does that give 195?
Yes.
Okay, so there's your answer, letter B. But you're using the law of sines from oblique triangles. How many had letter B? All right, does it make sense now? All right, and number 60. A publisher charges $15 for the first copy of a book that's ordered, $12 for each additional copy. Which represents the cost of Y books? Oh, this one tripped me up. I put letter G. I said there's a $15 for the first one and then $12 after that. But how many books were sold? Y books, correct? And the first book is one of those Y books. So if you pay $15 for the first book and then $12 after that, you have to go back and realize, well, but that first book was $15. So it's not Y, but Y minus 1. Take off the first book. $12 times all books except the first one, plus 15. And I missed that when I first thought it through. should have been a 12y minus 12, which ends up giving us 12y plus 3, because I failed to account for the first book, and so I messed this one up, and then realized afterward, oh, duh. If y is total books, book number 1, all books except the first book. And there's our answer, letter F. All right, no homework this evening. However, you will have homework tomorrow evening. Okay, so we'll trade off homework, but no homework this evening. We'll get started back on your trig starting tomorrow. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and you are dismissed.